The transition from the structured reality of a planetary gravity well to the rhythmic, weightless hum of a long-distance scout vessel was a sensation that never truly lost its novelty. For Arthur, the ship was more than a collection of pressurized alloy and life support systems. It was a quiet sanctuary designed for the sole purpose of finding something new without the baggage of conquest or the noise of high-stakes politics. The vessel, named the Amber Wanderer, drifted through the periphery of a sector that had long been ignored by the larger galactic cartography guilds, a place where the stars were spaced just far enough apart to feel lonely, yet close enough to guide a patient traveler. Arthur spent the first few days of the journey recalibrating the internal atmosphere, ensuring the scent of recycled air was tempered with the faint, comforting aroma of dried chamomile and old paper. He did not care for the sterile efficiency favored by the more modern fleets. He preferred the feeling of a lived-in space where every hum of a coolant pipe told a story of endurance. As he checked the navigational charts on the primary console, he watched the telemetry streams flow across the screen in a steady, emerald glow. There was no rush to reach the destination, a stellar anomaly designated only by a string of cold coordinates that promised nothing more than a curious gravitational variance. In the quiet of the cockpit, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic click of the atmospheric scrubbers and the distant, melodic vibration of the sublight engines. Arthur reached for his mug, feeling the warmth of the ceramic against his palms, and looked out through the reinforced viewing port at the tapestry of the cosmos. It was a view that humbled him, a reminder that humanity's greatest strength was not its ability to dominate the void, but its capacity to simply exist within it and wonder what lay beyond the next horizon. The mission parameters were deliberately vague, a luxury afforded to independent explorers who funded their ventures through the sale of mundane atmospheric data and soil composition reports. Arthur had spent the better part of a decade moving from one forgotten system to another, never staying long enough to grow roots, but always long enough to understand the character of a world. This particular journey felt different, however. There was a softness to the data signatures he was receiving from the anomaly ahead. Usually, gravitational variances were harsh, jagged things that suggested a collapsing star or a dense pocket of dark matter, but this was a gentle, undulating pulse that felt almost organic in its frequency. He began to adjust the sensors, narrowing the focus to filter out the background radiation of the nearby binary system. As the resolution sharpened, a faint outline began to emerge from the darkness of the void. It was not a planet, nor was it a station of any known design. It appeared to be a massive, drifting structure of interlocking rings, overgrown with a luminescent flora that defied the vacuum of space. The sight was breathtaking, a testament to a biology that had adapted to the harshest environment imaginable. Arthur felt a surge of genuine excitement, the kind that made the hair on his arms stand up, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate. He had learned long ago that the universe did not reward the reckless. He began to prepare the Amber Wanderer for a close-range approach, calculating a trajectory that would bring him alongside the outer ring without disturbing the delicate balance of the structure's orbit. He wondered who had built such a thing, or if it had simply grown into existence over millions of years. A stray thought that made him smile as he tapped in the final commands for the docking thrusters. As the ship drew closer, the scale of the structure became truly apparent. The rings were miles across, constructed from a pale, translucent material that shimmered with an inner light, casting long, soft shadows across the hull of the Amber Wanderer. The vegetation was a deep, vibrant indigo, with long tendrils that swayed in the invisible currents of the solar wind like seaweed in a calm ocean. Arthur monitored the external sensors, surprised to find that the structure maintained a thin but stable atmosphere within the confines of its inner rings. It was a micro-ecosystem, a bubble of life sustained by the very radiation that usually destroyed it. He checked the life support readings once more, verifying that the pressure was sufficient for a standard environmental suit. The thought of stepping out onto those rings was both daunting and irresistible. He spent several hours double-checking his equipment, from the seal integrity of his boots to the oxygen flow in his primary tank. He moved through the small cabin of the ship, securing any loose items that might shift during the final approach. The interior of the Amber Wanderer was a reflection of his own steady nature, filled with small mementos of past travels, a smoothed stone from a desert world, a collection of hand-drawn maps, and a small, resilient fern that sat in a self-watering pot near the galley. He took a moment to water the plant, a small ritual that grounded him before the uncertainty of a first contact. There was a profound sense of peace in the routine, a way to bridge the gap between the known and the unknown. He donned his suit, the fabric familiar and heavy, and stepped into the airlock, listening to the hiss of the pumps as they equalized the pressure with the exterior environment. When the outer hatch finally slid open, Arthur was met with a sight that no sensor could truly capture. The air within the ring's influence was thick with glowing spores that drifted like fireflies in the twilight. They danced around his visor, leaving faint streaks of light that vanished as quickly as they appeared. He stepped out onto the surface of the ring, his magnetic boots finding a firm grip on the crystalline material. The ground beneath him was not solid rock, but a dense lattice of fibers that felt slightly springy underfoot. He moved with caution, his movements slow and calculated as he navigated through the thicket of indigo vines. The plants were warm to the touch, radiating a gentle heat that seeped through the insulation of his gloves. He could feel a faint vibration in the air, a low-frequency hum that resonated in his chest. It wasn't a mechanical sound, but rather the collective pulse of the flora, a rhythmic breathing that suggested the entire structure was a single, living entity. He knelt to examine a cluster of small, bell-shaped flowers that grew near the base of a massive archway. As his shadow fell over them, they pulsed with a soft gold light, as if acknowledging his presence. There was no hostility here, no sense of danger lurking in the shadows. It was a place of quiet growth and ancient patience. Arthur began to record his findings, speaking softly into his suit's comms system, his voice a low murmur that seemed to fit the atmosphere of the ring. He described the texture of the plants, the quality of the light, and the strange, comforting weight of the air. He felt like a guest in a very old, very grand house, one where the hosts had stepped away for a moment, but left the lights on for any weary traveler who might find their way to the door. He spent the next few hours exploring the immediate vicinity of his landing site, discovering a network of pathways that were woven into the very structure of the ring. These were not the geometric roads of a planned city, but natural clearings that suggested the movement of something large and slow. He followed one of these paths toward the inner edge of the ring, where the view opened up to show the vast, empty center of the structure. In the middle of the void, suspended by thin, shimmering threads of light, was a smaller sphere that glowed with a steady, white radiance. It looked like a seed, or perhaps a heart, the central point around which all the rings rotated. Arthur watched it for a long time, mesmerized by the slow, hypnotic movement of the threads as they swayed in the cosmic breeze. He wondered if this was a nursery for stars or a sanctuary for a species that had long since transcended the need for planets. The sheer scale of the engineering, or the biology, was beyond anything in the recorded history of the outer colonies. Yet, despite the magnitude of the discovery, Arthur felt no urge to rush back and report it. He wanted to sit in this quiet garden for a while longer, to absorb the stillness and the sense of belonging that the place radiated. He found a flat outcrop of crystalline rock and sat down, leaning back against a cluster of soft, mossy growth. From this vantage point, he could see the amber wanderer perched on the edge of the ring, a small orange speck against the vast indigo landscape. It looked like a toy, a reminder of how small his world had been until this moment. He took a deep breath, the filtered air of his suit tasting of ozone and something sweet, like ripening fruit. He knew that this was only the beginning of his journey here, and that the rings had many more secrets to share, but for now, the silence was enough. As the sun of the distant binary system began to dip below the curve of the structure, the colors of the ring shifted from indigo to a deep, royal purple. The glowing spores became more numerous, filling the air with a dense fog of light that obscured the horizon. Arthur watched as the light from the central sphere intensified, casting long, elegant shadows through the archways and vines. He felt a profound sense of gratitude for the series of small, seemingly insignificant choices that had led him to this point. If he hadn't chosen the independent path, if he hadn't insisted on maintaining his own ship, if he hadn't listened to the faint whisper of the gravitational variance, he would never have seen this. The universe was full of such wonders, hidden in the folds of space, waiting for someone with the patience to look. He stood up, his joints feeling light and supple in the low gravity, and began the slow walk back to the airlock. He would need to rest and prepare for a more thorough exploration of the inner rings in the morning. As he climbed back into the Amber Wanderer and sealed the hatch, the familiar sights and sounds of the cabin welcomed him back like an old friend. He shed his suit, hanging it carefully in the locker, and made himself a fresh pot of tea. The ship felt smaller now, but also more secure, a tiny bubble of humanity nestled within the vast, alien beauty of the rings. He sat at his small desk, opening his journal to a fresh page, and began to write. He didn't write for an audience or for a guild. He wrote to capture the feeling of the spores against his visor and the warmth of the indigo vines. He wrote until his eyes grew heavy and the tea turned cold in the mug. In the morning, he would go deeper into the rings, but tonight he would sleep soundly, lulled by the gentle pulse of a world that was just beginning to wake up to his presence. The dreams he had that night were not of the cold void or the sterile corridors of the stations he had left behind. Instead, they were filled with the sound of wind rushing through invisible forests and the sensation of floating in a sea of liquid light. He woke up feeling refreshed, the lingering sense of peace from the rings still present in his mind. He spent the early hours of the ship's morning cycle performing routine maintenance, checking the fuel cells and the integrity of the thermal shields. The Amber Wanderer was performing perfectly, its systems seemingly buoyed by the stable environment of the rings. After a quick breakfast of reconstituted porridge and a handful of dried berries, he prepared for his second excursion. This time he packed a portable sensor array and a more robust communication relay, hoping to establish a stronger link with the ship's computer as he moved further from the landing site. He also took a small camera, hoping to capture images that would do justice to the scale of the structure. As he stepped back out into the airlock, he felt a sense of anticipation that was even stronger than the day before. The rings were waiting, their secrets tucked away in the shadows of the indigo vines and the shimmer of the crystalline paths. He stepped out onto the surface, and this time he didn't stop to admire the view. He began to walk, his eyes fixed on the distant archways that led toward the inner layers of the structure. He was an explorer, after all, and there was a whole world of light and growth waiting to be understood. The journey was long, and the path was winding, But Arthur moved with a steady purpose, his heart light and his mind open to whatever the verdant drift had to show him next. The path he chose led him through a series of interconnected chambers, each one larger than the last. The walls were made of the same translucent material as the exterior, but here they were etched with intricate patterns that reminded him of the veins in a leaf or the deltas of a great river. These patterns pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, synchronized with the hum he had felt the previous day. It was as if the very walls were circulating energy, keeping the ecosystem alive. He stopped to examine one of the etchings, tracing the lines with his gloved fingers. They were smooth and cool, with a precision that suggested a conscious hand, yet they felt entirely natural, as if they had grown into the shape rather than being carved. He wondered if the builders of this place were still here, perhaps dormant or living in a form that he couldn't yet recognize. The lack of any recognizable technology, like wires or terminals, was striking. Everything was integrated, a seamless blend of biology and architecture. As he moved deeper, the vegetation became more varied. He saw tall, slender stalks that ended in wide, translucent leaves, which seemed to capture the stray light from the central sphere and funnel it down into the roots. There were small, skittering creatures as well, no larger than his hand, with multiple pairs of gossamer wings and iridescent shells. They moved with a frantic grace, darting between the leaves to collect the glowing spores. They didn't seem afraid of him. One even landed briefly on his shoulder, its wings vibrating with a high-pitched buzz before it took off again to join its kin. Arthur felt a deep sense of privilege to be witnessing this hidden world, a place where life had found a way to thrive in the most unlikely of circumstances. The air grew thicker as he approached the inner ring, the pressure increasing slightly but remaining well within the safety limits of his suit. He found himself in a vast arboretum where the ceiling stretched up hundreds of feet, disappearing into a haze of golden light. In the center of the chamber was a large, circular pool filled with a clear, shimmering liquid that wasn't water. It had a higher viscosity, and small ripples moved across its surface even though there was no wind. Arthur set up his sensor array near the edge of the pool, curious to see what the readings would reveal. The liquid was rich in complex organic molecules, acting as a sort of nutrient bath for the entire ring system. He realized that the pool was part of a larger circulatory system, a heart that pumped life through the crystalline veins he had seen earlier. As he watched, a large, translucent leaf dipped into the pool, absorbing the liquid with a soft, slurping sound. The simplicity and elegance of the system were staggering. It was a closed-loop environment, perfectly balanced and entirely self-sustaining. He spent a long time documenting the chamber, his camera capturing the play of light on the water and the intricate dance of the winged creatures. He felt a profound sense of calm, a stillness that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath him. It was a place where time felt irrelevant, where the slow cycles of growth and renewal were the only things that mattered. He thought about the world he had come from, with its constant noise and its endless drive for more, and it felt distant and small. Here there was enough, and that was a beautiful thing to realize. As he prepared to leave the arboretum, he noticed a small opening in the far wall, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. It was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person in an environmental suit to pass through. Curiosity got the better of him, and he carefully pushed through the vines, his sensors picking up a faint, rhythmic signal from the other side. The passage led to a small, quiet room that felt different from the rest of the structure. The walls were not translucent, but a deep, matte black, absorbing all light except for a single, glowing console in the center. It was the first piece of recognizable technology he had found, though its design was unlike anything he had ever seen. There were no buttons or screens, just a series of recessed pits filled with glowing sand. Arthur approached the console with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He didn't want to disturb whatever function it served, but the desire to understand was too strong. He reached out a hand, hovering it over the sand. As he did, the grains began to shift, forming shapes and patterns that mirrored his own thoughts. He saw images of the rings, of the central sphere, and of the distant stars. It was an interface, one that operated on a level of neural resonance. He realized that the console was a repository of knowledge, a record of the history and purpose of the verdant drift. He didn't try to download the data or force a connection. He simply stood there, letting the images wash over him. He saw the birth of the rings, the long centuries of growth, and the quiet departure of the beings who had created them. They hadn't died or been conquered. They had simply moved on, leaving this sanctuary behind for whoever might find it. It was a gift, a legacy of peace left in the vastness of the void. Arthur spent hours in the quiet room, learning the silent language of the sand. He didn't find any grand secrets or powerful weapons. Instead, he found stories of gardening, of the careful cultivation of light, and of the importance of watching the stars. The creators of the drift had been observers, scholars of the natural world who believed that the greatest achievement was to live in harmony with the cosmos. They had built the rings as a laboratory and a retreat, a place to study the intersection of biology and stellar energy. When they felt their work was done, they had left the doors unlocked, trusting that whoever followed would respect the sanctity of the space. Arthur felt a deep connection to these nameless architects, a shared understanding of the value of the quiet path. He finally stepped away from the console, the sand settling back into its original, motionless state. The room felt even more peaceful now that he understood its purpose. He made his way back through the passage, the vines closing behind him like a secret kept. As he walked back through the arboretum and toward the outer rings, he felt a sense of clarity that he had never experienced before. His mission was no longer just about data or exploration. It was about stewardship. He would keep the secret of the verdant drift, protecting it from those who would seek to exploit its beauty or harness its energy. He would be the gardener of this place, a silent watcher who ensured that the light continued to pulse and the spores continued to dance. The walk back to the Amber Wanderer was long, but Arthur didn't mind. He moved with a new sense of belonging, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the crystalline ground. The binary suns were rising again, casting a warm, golden glow across the indigo landscape. He saw the small, winged creatures beginning their morning harvest, and he felt a kinship with them. They were all part of the same cycle, all inhabitants of this remarkable sanctuary. When he finally reached the ship, he took one last look at the vast, shimmering rings before entering the airlock. He felt a sense of homecoming as the hatch sealed behind him. He removed his suit, the air of the cabin smelling of chamomile and the faint, sweet scent of the spores that had clung to his fabric. He sat at his console, but instead of preparing a report for the guild, he began to erase the coordinates of the anomaly from his navigational logs. He would leave a false trail, a series of dead ends that would lead any curious travelers away from this sector. He would protect the drift with the same quiet determination that the creators had used to build it. As he finished the task, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was no longer just a scout, he was a guardian. He leaned back in his chair, watching the stars through the viewing port. The Amber Wanderer would stay here for a while, drifting in the gentle pull of the rings, and Arthur would spend his days in the garden, learning the secrets of the light and the silence of the void. The second week of Arthur's stay within the gravitational embrace of the rings brought a subtle shift in the environment's temperament. The internal atmosphere of the Amber Wanderer had fully synchronized with the external sense of the drift, creating a seamless transition whenever he cycled the airlock. He spent his mornings in the galley, watching the way the light from the central sphere refracted through the condensation on the windows. The orange-gold glow of the ship's interior lights felt less like a necessity and more like a complement to the purple and indigo hues of the world outside. He had taken to referring to the structure as the bloom, a name that felt more appropriate than a technical designation. His primary task for the day was to venture toward the secondary ring, a structure that appeared more densely forested than the one he had initially explored. To reach it, he would need to navigate a series of translucent bridges that spanned the gap between the rotating layers. These bridges were not physical spans in the traditional sense, but focused ribbons of solidified light that pulsed with the same frequency as the central heart. Arthur felt a flicker of nervous energy as he prepared his gear. The engineering involved in creating stable walking surfaces out of photon pressure was beyond anything he had encountered in his years of scouting. But the bloom had already proven that it operated on a logic far removed from the cold, metallic certainties of the outer colonies. As he stepped out onto the surface of the first ring, the indigo vines seemed to lean toward him, their small, bell-shaped flowers ringing with a vibration that he could feel in the soles of his boots. He walked toward the edge of the crystalline plateau where the first light bridge began. It was a shimmering path of pale azure, extending across the 3-mile void to the next ring. Arthur took a tentative step, his magnetic boots deactivated to avoid interfering with the bridge's coherence. The surface was firm, yet it felt like walking on a layer of dense, pressurized air. Beneath his feet, the stars were visible through the translucent blue, a reminder that he was suspended in the heart of a cosmic garden. He moved slowly, his eyes fixed on the destination. The secondary ring was a riot of color. Where the first ring was dominated by indigo and violet, this one was a tapestry of emerald, gold, and deep crimson. The vegetation here was taller, more structured, forming cathedrals of interlocking branches that reached toward the central light. As he neared the midpoint of the bridge, the hum of the bloom intensified, turning into a low, harmonic chord that seemed to resonate with the very water in his cells. It wasn't loud, but it was all-encompassing, a sound that felt like the memory of a warm afternoon. Upon reaching the secondary ring, Arthur was immediately struck by the humidity. The air was thick and sweet, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Huge, fan-like leaves, each the size of a small shuttle, hung from the overhead canopy, dripping with the same iridescent nutrient fluid he had seen in the arboretum. He found himself in a clearing where the ground was covered in a soft, silver moss that felt like velvet. He knelt to collect a sample, but as his fingers touched the moss, it rippled with a wave of light that moved away from him in concentric circles. It was a reactive network, a sensory organ for the ring itself. Arthur realized that every step he took was being felt and recorded by the ecosystem. He spoke into his suit's recorder, his voice hushed to avoid disturbing the stillness. He noted the presence of larger fauna here, slender, six-legged creatures with fur like spun glass that moved through the undergrowth with a liquid grace. They watched him with large, multifaceted eyes that held no fear, only a calm, inquisitive stillness. They were the gardeners of this level, their long snouts designed to prune the dying leaves and distribute seeds through the silver moss. Arthur felt like a guest who had stumbled into the private quarters of a master artisan. He followed a winding trail that led deeper into the emerald woods, passing beneath arches of bioluminescent fungi that cast a soft, greenish light on the path. The further he went, the more he noticed the presence of small, hollowed-out structures made of woven vines. These were not dwellings in the human sense. They lacked doors or furniture, but they felt intentional, like resting places for weary travelers. He stepped inside one and found the interior lined with a soft, aromatic resin that glowed with a faint amber light. It was a place of absolute quiet, the thick walls of vegetation muffling even the constant hum of the bloom. Sitting there, Arthur felt a profound sense of disconnection from the timeline of his own life. The deadlines, the fuel costs, and the lonely stretches of the void felt like dreams belonging to someone else. He took out his notebook, but instead of sketching maps or writing down coordinates, he found himself drawing the patterns of the leaves and trying to describe the specific shade of the silver moss. He realized that the bloom wasn't just a place to be studied, it was a place to be felt. It was a sanctuary that demanded a different kind of attention, one that required the observer to slow down and match the pace of the growing vines. As the day progressed, he reached a massive spire at the center of the secondary ring. It was a column of pure, white crystal that rose hundreds of feet into the air, its surface carved with the same river delta patterns he had seen in the quiet room. At the base of the spire, a group of the glass-furred creatures had gathered, their heads bowed in what looked like a collective trance. Arthur stayed at the edge of the clearing, unwilling to interrupt the scene. He watched as the spire began to glow with an intense, pulsing light, synchronized with the heartbeat of the central sphere. The light flowed down the patterns on the crystal, pooling at the base, before being absorbed by the silver moss. It was a distribution of energy, a feeding cycle that sustained the entire ring. The creatures seemed to be acting as conductors, their bodies vibrating in harmony with the spire. After a few minutes, the light faded and the creatures dispersed, moving back into the woods with a renewed energy. Arthur approached the spire once the clearing was empty, placing a hand against the cool crystal. He felt a faint tingling sensation, a residue of the power that had just passed through it. It was a clean, efficient system of life support that put human technology to shame. There was no waste, no friction, only the elegant transfer of light into life. He spent the afternoon exploring the edges of the Emerald Woods, finding several more light bridges that led to the tertiary rings. These outer layers appeared more specialized, with one ring consisting entirely of floating islands of vegetation suspended in a dense, gaseous atmosphere, and another that seemed to be a massive solar collector, its surface covered in dark, metallic leaves that drank in the radiation of the binary stars. The complexity of the bloom was staggering, a nested series of environments that catered to every possible stage of biological development. Arthur felt a sense of awe at the vision of the architects. They hadn't just built a station, they had built a legacy of endurance. He wondered if the creatures he saw were the descendants of the original inhabitants, or if they had been engineered to maintain the system long after the masters were gone. Either way, the bloom was a living testament to the idea that humanity, or any intelligent species, could be something other than a consumer of resources. They could be creators of harmony. By the time he began the trek back to the Amber Wanderer, the sky of the bloom had turned a deep, bruised plum. The light bridges were now the brightest things in the void, ribbons of sapphire and gold that connected the rotating worlds. Arthur felt a deep, physical exhaustion, but his mind was more alert than it had been in years. He crossed the azure bridge with a confident stride, no longer bothered by the vast emptiness below. He felt a part of the structure now, a temporary inhabitant of the great garden. As he reached the first ring and saw the orange hull of his ship, he felt a strange pang of reluctance. The Amber Wanderer was his home, but the bloom felt like a destination he had been searching for without even knowing it. He entered the airlock, the familiar hiss of the pumps sounding louder and harsher than the soft hum of the rings. He stripped off his suit and headed straight for the galley, where he prepared a meal of soup and fresh bread. The simple flavors were grounding, a reminder of his own biological needs in a world that seemed to live on light and resonance. That evening, Arthur sat at his desk and looked at the data he had collected. The sensor readings were a chaotic mess of organic signatures and high-frequency vibrations that defied easy classification. He knew that if he sent this data to the Guild, they would send a fleet within months. They would bring heavy drills, atmospheric harvesters, and containment units. They would try to quantify the light and bottle the resonance. They would turn the bloom into a resource. Arthur looked at the delete key for a long time. He thought about the silver moss and the glass-furred creatures. He thought about the white spire and the way the light felt like a physical touch. He realized that some things were too precious to be shared with a world that wasn't ready to respect them. He began to purge the sensor logs, one by one, replacing the complex data with corrupted files and null readings. He would report the system as a gravitational graveyard, a place of dead stars and empty space. It was the only way to ensure that the bloom stayed silent and safe. He finished the task just as the central sphere reached its lowest point of luminosity, the night of the rings. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the console and the distant, shimmering spores outside the window. Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. He had made his choice. He would stay here for as long as his supplies lasted, perhaps even longer if he could learn to harvest the nutrient fluid from the pools. He was no longer a scout for the Guild. He was a guest of the verdant drift. He lay down in his bunk, listening to the soft, rhythmic click of the ship's life support, which now seemed to be beating in time with the heart of the rings. In the morning, he would return to the quiet room and the console of sand. There were more stories to learn, more patterns to understand. The bloom was a book that had been left open for him, and he intended to read every page. As he drifted off to sleep, he imagined the silver moss growing over the hull of the Amber Wanderer, slowly turning his ship into just another part of the garden, a small, orange seed waiting to bloom in the heart of the void. The following morning, the ship's internal chronometer signaled the start of a new cycle, but Arthur found himself ignoring the artificial schedule. He spent several hours simply watching the way the spores drifted through the air outside, their movements influenced by the subtle shifts in the ring's magnetic field. He had begun to notice a pattern in their glow, a sequence of pulses that seemed to correspond to the rotation of the inner rings. It was a language of light, a slow-motion conversation between the flora and the star. He decided to leave the Amber Wanderer with even less equipment than before, taking only a small water canteen and a handheld light meter. He wanted to feel the environment without the barrier of heavy sensors or recording devices. As he stepped out onto the crystalline surface, he felt the familiar warmth of the indigo vines. This time, he didn't follow the established paths. He pushed through a thicket of purple ferns, heading toward a cluster of high, translucent arches that he had seen from the bridge the day before. The ground here was uneven, composed of large, overlapping plates of the same clear material as the ring's base, but these were covered in a layer of fine, golden dust that shimmered like ground topaz. Behind the arches lay a grove of singing trees. They were tall, spindly things with metallic bark and leaves that looked like thin sheets of hammered copper. As the solar wind moved through the ring's thin atmosphere, the leaves vibrated against one another, creating a sound like 1,000 tiny bells ringing in the distance. It wasn't music in the human sense, but a harmonic frequency that seemed to clear Arthur's mind of all lingering stress. He sat at the base of one of the trees, feeling the vibration through the trunk. He realized that the trees were not just aesthetic, they were structural, their roots extending deep into the ring to stabilize the crystalline plates against the centrifugal forces of the rotation. The entire bloom was a masterpiece of integrated function. He stayed in the grove for hours, lost in the sound and the play of light on the copper leaves. He found himself thinking about the people he had left behind, the recruiters at the guild, the dock workers at the frontier stations, the other scouts who were always racing to find the next big score. They seemed like ghosts now, figures from a frantic, cluttered past. Here, there was only the wind and the bells. As he prepared to leave the grove, he noticed a small, crystalline pedestal sitting in the center of a circle of silver moss. On top of the pedestal was a single, perfectly spherical fruit, glowing with a soft, internal warmth. It looked like a gift. Arthur approached it with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. He knew the risks of consuming alien biology, but the bloom had shown him nothing but hospitality. He picked up the fruit, which felt heavy and smooth in his hand. It smelled of citrus and rain. He took a small bite, and a burst of flavor exploded across his senses, sweet, tart, and deeply refreshing. As he ate, he felt a sudden surge of vitality, a warmth spreading through his limbs that made the aches of age and travel vanish. It wasn't a drug. It was pure, concentrated energy tailored for a biological system. He realized then that the bloom was not just a sanctuary, it was a provider. It was capable of sustaining life in all its forms, provided that life was willing to exist in balance with the whole. He finished the fruit and placed the pit back on the pedestal, a small gesture of respect. Within seconds, the silver moss began to wrap around the pit, pulling it down into the ground to start the cycle anew. Arthur returned to his ship as the binary suns reached their zenith, the light reflecting off the rings in a blinding, beautiful display of radiance. He felt a sense of belonging that he had never found on any colony world. The Amber Wanderer was his vessel, but the bloom was his home. He began to plan for a longer stay, calculating how he could modify the ship's scrubbers to process the local atmosphere more efficiently. He would need to be careful, but he was confident that he could adapt. He was no longer just an explorer, he was a part of the ecosystem. He spent the evening at his desk, but instead of writing about the guild or the mission, he wrote a letter to no one in particular, describing the feeling of the copper leaves and the taste of the golden fruit. He knew the letter would never be sent, but the act of writing it helped him process the transformation he was undergoing. He was shedding his old life, one layer at a time, and becoming something new. In the silence of the cabin, the only sound was the scratching of his pen and the distant, rhythmic hum of the heart of the rings. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The third week within the verdant drift began with a phenomenon Arthur had not yet witnessed, the Great Respiration. It started as a subtle deepening of the ambient hum, a low-frequency thrum that made the tea in his mug dance in concentric circles. Outside the viewing port, the indigo vines and emerald canopies did not just sway, they pulsed in a synchronized expansion. Every leaf and tendril across the visible rings seemed to draw in the solar radiation of the binary suns, turning a shade of incandescent gold before slowly exhaling a cloud of shimmering spores. This rhythmic breathing lasted for several hours, during which the Amber Wanderer felt less like a machine and more like a stowaway inside the lung of a titan. Arthur watched from the cockpit, his senses disabled by choice, preferring to witness the event through his own eyes. The sheer volume of biological energy being moved was staggering. It was a reminder that the bloom was not a static garden, but a high-energy engine of life, converting the raw power of stars into the softest, most delicate forms of existence. When the respiration finally subsided, the air outside was so thick with glowing particles that the ship appeared to be submerged in a sea of liquid starlight. Arthur decided that this was the day he would explore the tertiary ring, the one he had identified as the solar collector. To get there, he would have to traverse a bridge of a different nature, not a span of light, but a series of floating, crystalline platforms that drifted in a slow, magnetic ballet between the second and third tiers. He donned his suit, though he left the internal oxygen supply on its lowest setting, trusting the bloom's thickening atmosphere. As he stepped out, the air felt vibrant, almost electric against the fabric of his sleeves. The floating platforms were massive, flat-topped gems that caught the light and cast rainbows across the void. Jumping from one to the next required a leap of faith, but the low gravity and the gentle magnetic pull of the stones guided his path. With each leap, Arthur felt a growing sense of liberation. The heavy boots that had once felt like anchors now felt like wings. He was moving through the architecture of a dream, where the laws of physics had been tempered by the needs of a forest. The solar collector ring was a stark contrast to the lush arboretums of the inner circles. Here, the vegetation was dark, almost obsidian, with broad, flat surfaces designed to absorb as much radiation as possible. The leaves were cool to the touch despite the intense light, as they efficiently funneled the energy down through thick, rope-like stalks into the ring's core. There was a metallic tang to the air here, the scent of ozone and warm minerals. As Arthur walked among these dark giants, he realized he was standing on the power plant of the entire structure. The energy gathered here was what powered the light bridges, the nutrient pools, and the central heart. He found a maintenance crawlway, or the biological equivalent, a hollowed-out vine that ran along the spine of the ring. Inside, pulses of golden light raced past him at incredible speeds, headed toward the inner rings. He placed his hand against the inner wall of the vine and felt the rush of power. It was the lifeblood of the bloom, a river of light that never ceased its flow. Deep within the solar ring, Arthur discovered a series of chambers that appeared to be dedicated to the storage of information. Unlike the quiet room with its console of sand, these chambers used light itself as the medium of record. Suspended in the center of each room were intricate lattices of frozen light, shaped like complex snowflakes. When he moved his hand near them, the lattices would spin, projecting images and sounds into the air. He saw the formation of the binary stars, the arrival of the architects, and the slow, patient construction of the rings. There were no words, only the raw data of experience. He saw the architects, slender, multi-limbed beings who moved with a grace that suggested they were as much at home in the vacuum as they were on a planet. They hadn't built the bloom as a fortress or a factory, but as a laboratory for the soul. They wanted to see if life could be sustained indefinitely through the pure application of harmony and light. The lattices showed centuries of failure and adjustment until the perfect balance was finally achieved. As he moved from one lattice to the next, Arthur realized that the architects had been gone for a very long time, yet their work continued without a single error. The bloom was a self-correcting system, capable of healing itself and adapting to the changing output of the stars. He saw images of asteroids being gently deflected by magnetic fields and of solar flares being harvested for a surplus of energy. The intelligence of the system was not located in a single computer or brain, but was distributed across every leaf, creature, and crystalline plate. It was a collective consciousness of growth. Arthur felt a deep humility in the face of such a legacy. Humanity's greatest achievements, the sprawling stations, the hyperlanes, the terraformed worlds, seemed crude and temporary in comparison. The architects had achieved a form of immortality not by living forever, but by creating something that would never need to end. In the final chamber of the solar ring, the light lattice was different. It didn't show the past. It seemed to be reacting to the present. As Arthur approached, the snowflake-shaped light shifted, mirroring his own form. He saw himself as the bloom saw him, a small, carbon-based life form, surprisingly resilient, characterized by a profound sense of curiosity. The lattice began to glow with a soft, welcoming warmth. It was an invitation to contribute. Arthur understood that the bloom was always looking for new data, new ways of experiencing the universe. He closed his eyes and thought about the cold beauty of the deep void, the smell of rain on a dusty plain, and the sound of a human voice in the dark. He felt a gentle pull on his mind, a soft sensation of sharing. He wasn't being drained, he was being heard. He gave the bloom his memories of the stars he had visited, the people he had known, and the quiet moments of wonder he had experienced during his years as a scout. In return, the bloom filled his mind with the sensation of roots stretching deep into a warm earth and the feeling of a leaf unfurling toward a distant sun. When the connection finally broke, Arthur found himself sitting on the floor of the chamber, his face wet with tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of connection. He was no longer an outsider looking in, he was a part of the record. He had added his own small thread to the luminous tapestry of the drift. He stayed in the chamber for a long time, watching the light lattice pulse with the new information he had provided. He felt a sense of purpose that transcended his duties to the guild or his own survival. He was a witness to the greatest garden in the galaxy, and his presence was a valid and valued part of its existence. He stood up, his legs feeling strong and certain, and began the long journey back to the second ring. The return trip was easier, as if the bloom were actively assisting his movements. The floating platforms seemed to drift closer as he approached, and the light bridges felt more stable under his feet. By the time he reached the emerald woods of the second ring, the afternoon light was beginning to fade into the royal purple of the evening. He stopped by the white spire, where the glass-furred creatures were once again gathering for their evening feeding. This time, they didn't just watch him. One of the smaller creatures approached him, sniffing at his suit with its long, delicate snout. Arthur remained perfectly still, his breath shallow. The creature let out a soft, trilling sound and nudged his hand with its head. Its fur felt like soft, warm silk. For a moment, the gap between species vanished, replaced by a simple, shared existence in a peaceful place. The creature then turned and joined its kin, leaving Arthur with a sense of wonder that no amount of technical data could ever replicate. He reached the Amber Wanderer just as the first spores of the evening began to rise. Inside the cabin, everything looked the same, the chamomile tea, the maps, the small fern in its pot, but it all felt different to Arthur. The ship was no longer a cage or a shield, it was a cocoon. He sat at his desk and looked at the blank page of his journal. He didn't know how to put into words what he had experienced in the solar ring. How do you describe the feeling of being known by a garden? He finally wrote a single sentence. The light is not just energy, it is memory. It was enough for now. He knew that the days ahead would bring more discoveries, more challenges, and more opportunities to serve the bloom. He was prepared for all of it. As he prepared for bed, he looked out at the central sphere, which was now glowing with a soft, lunar light. He thought about the guild, wondering if they were still searching for him or if they had already written him off as another casualty of the void. He hoped they would never find this place. He hoped the falls trail he had laid would hold, keeping the bloom hidden in its pocket of silence and light. He was the gardener now, the keeper of the record, and he would protect this sanctuary with everything he was. He lay down in his bunk, the rhythmic pulse of the heart of the rings lulling him into a deep, dreamless sleep. Outside, the spores continued their dance, and the dark leaves of the solar ring continued to drink in the light of the distant stars, ensuring that the verdant drift would remain a beacon of peace in a loud and crowded universe. The next morning, Arthur woke with a clear plan. He would begin the process of integrating his ship systems with the ring's energy grid. It would be a delicate operation, requiring him to bypass several of the Amber Wanderer's safety protocols, but he was confident he could do it. He wanted to reduce his reliance on the ship's finite fuel cells and instead draw power directly from the solar collector. He spent the morning in the ship's engineering bay, stripping wires and recalibrating the power converters. It was satisfying work, a blend of human ingenuity and alien abundance. By midday, he had managed to establish a stable connection, and for the first time in years, the ship's internal lights weren't humming with the strain of a dying battery. They were bright, steady, and powered by the binary stars themselves. Arthur felt a surge of pride. He was truly becoming a permanent resident of the drift. He celebrated by making a large pot of tea and sitting by the viewing port, watching the endless, beautiful cycle of the garden. He was a man who had found his place in the cosmos, and for the first time in his life, he was not looking for a way out. The fourth week within the verdant drift was marked by a shift in the local celestial alignment. The binary suns moved into a position that bathed the rings in a perpetual, soft twilight of rose and amber. This change in illumination triggered a secondary growth phase in the lower canopies of the second ring, where Arthur had spent much of his time. New blossoms, shaped like delicate glass trumpets, uncurled from the bark of the copper trees. These flowers did not emit light. Instead, they seemed to pull it in, creating small pockets of velvet darkness around them. Arthur found that if he stood near these blossoms, the ambient hum of the bloom changed once more. It was no longer a single, unified chord, but a complex overlay of whispers, the sound of liquid moving through roots, the vibration of wings, and the slow, grinding expansion of the crystalline foundations. He spent his mornings walking among these trumpets, his boots treading softly on the silver moss, listening to the secrets of the soil. He had stopped wearing his full environmental suit within the second ring, opting instead for a lightweight breather and a heavy wool sweater. The air was rich, warm, and smelled of ancient earth and ozone, a combination that made his lungs feel stronger with every breath. His goal for this cycle was to locate the source of the nutrient pools. He suspected that the fluid was not merely a byproduct of the plants, but a carefully synthesized mixture produced in a central hub. To find it, he followed the largest of the crystalline veins, a translucent pipe the size of a transit tunnel that ran beneath the surface of the first ring. The vein pulsed with a steady, rhythmic pressure, guiding him toward the nadir of the structure, a place where the rings met in a complex junction of rotating joints and massive, glowing gaskets. The descent was steep, requiring him to use a series of handholds carved into the crystalline walls. As he went deeper, the temperature rose, and the light from the central sphere was replaced by the warm, orange glow of the nutrient fluid rushing through the pipes. He felt like a stowaway in the circulatory system of a giant, a thought that brought him more comfort than fear. At the base of the descent, Arthur emerged into a cavernous chamber that served as the filtration and synthesis center for the bloom. It was a place of incredible mechanical beauty, where the biological and the crystalline were completely indistinguishable. Massive, translucent bladders hung from the ceiling, filled with the glowing fluid in various stages of refinement. Beneath them, a forest of slender, glass-like tubes spiraled together, acting as heat exchangers and chemical processors. The sound here was a deep, rhythmic thrumming, the heartbeat of the entire sanctuary. Arthur moved through the chamber with a sense of reverence, his light meter registering a stable, high-energy environment. In the center of the room was a large, open vat where the final nutrient mixture was collected before being pumped back to the rings. He approached the edge and saw his reflection in the shimmering surface. He looked different. His skin had a healthier glow, and the lines of weariness around his eyes had begun to fade. The drift was changing him, smoothing out the rough edges of a life spent in the harsh corners of the galaxy. As he explored the perimeter of the vat, he noticed a series of recessed alcoves in the walls. Each alcove contained a small, glowing pedestal, similar to the one where he had found the golden fruit. On these pedestals sat clusters of crystalline cylinders, etched with fine, microscopic lines. Arthur realized these were the blueprints for the nutrient fluid, the chemical recipes that sustained the myriad forms of life within the rings. He picked one up, and as his skin made contact with the crystal, a flood of sensory information entered his mind. He didn't see images this time. He felt the requirements of the silver moss, the nutritional needs of the glass-furred creatures, and the specific mineral balance needed to maintain the copper trees. The architects had left nothing to chance. They had designed a system that could synthesize any biological requirement from the raw energy of the stars. It was a kitchen that could feed an entire world, and the menu was written in the language of molecules. Arthur spent several hours in the synthesis chamber, learning the hidden chemistry of the garden. He discovered that the fluid was also responsible for the repair of the crystalline structure. Tiny, specialized spores within the mixture would settle in any cracks or fissures, hardening into new crystal and restoring the integrity of the rings. This explained why the bloom looked as pristine as the day it was built, despite the passage of eons. The system was a self-healing masterpiece. He felt a sudden, profound realization. The Amber Wanderer could also be part of this cycle. If he could introduce the repair spores into the ship's hull, the vessel would eventually become a living extension of the rings, its metal skin reinforced by the same crystalline lattice that held the bloom together. It was a radical idea, one that would make the ship forever inseparable from this place, but Arthur found the prospect enticing. He filled several canisters with the concentrated spore slurry, intending to test the theory on the ship's airlock. On his way back up to the first ring, Arthur took a detour through a section of the structure he had previously ignored, a quiet, shadowed corridor that led toward the center of the primary rotation. Here, the walls were covered in a dense, bioluminescent moss that pulsed with a slow blue light. The air was cooler, and the whispers of the glass trumpets were replaced by a profound, expectant silence. At the end of the corridor was a door, the first physical door he had seen in the bloom. It was made of a dark, heavy wood that looked like it had been carved from the heart of a planetary forest. There were no locks or handles, only a small, circular depression in the center. Arthur placed his hand in the depression, and the door slid upward with a soft, melodic chime. Inside was the Archive of Whispers. The room was a vast, circular library, but there were no books or screens. Instead, the walls were lined with thousands of small glass spheres, each one suspended in a niche of soft, glowing sand. Arthur approached one of the spheres and touched it. Immediately, the room was filled with the sound of a voice, not a human voice, but a melodic, multitonal speech that he could somehow understand. It was the voice of an architect, recording a personal observation about the way the light hit the inner rings during a solar eclipse. He moved to another sphere and heard a description of the first time a glass-furred creature had been seen tending the silver moss. These were not technical logs or historical records, they were memories. The archive was a collection of the personal thoughts, feelings, and observations of everyone who had ever lived within the drift. It was the emotional history of the sanctuary. Arthur sat in the center of the archive, surrounded by the voices of the past. He felt a deep sense of companionship. He was not the first person to feel the peace of the rings, nor was he the first to wonder at the scale of the architect's vision. Every fear he had felt, every moment of awe, had been experienced before and recorded here for posterity. The archive was a testament to the fact that intelligence was not just about solving problems or building structures. It was about the capacity to feel and to remember. He stayed in the room for a long time, listening to the echoes of 1,000 lifetimes. He heard stories of joy, of quiet contemplation, and of the peaceful departure of a species that had finally found its place in the harmony of the universe. The voices were not ghosts. They were a living part of the bloom, their energy preserved in the glass spheres and the glowing sand. When he finally left the archive, the night of the rings had arrived. The sky was a deep, velvet indigo, and the central sphere was a soft, silver orb. Arthur walked back to the Amber Wanderer with a renewed sense of purpose. He felt like he had been given the keys to a kingdom, but it was a kingdom that required nothing from him except his presence and his respect. He entered the ship and immediately began the process of applying the repair spores to the inner hatch of the airlock. As he worked, he spoke softly to the ship, telling it about the voices in the archive and the chemistry of the nutrient pools. He felt a strange, growing connection to the machine, as if it were beginning to listen. By the time he finished, the spores had already begun to glow with a faint blue light, anchoring themselves to the alloy of the hatch. That night, Arthur did not write in his journal. Instead, he sat in the cockpit and watched the stars, his mind filled with the melodies of the archive. He realized that the drift was more than a home, it was a sanctuary for the spirit. It was a place where the noise of the galaxy could be filtered out, leaving only the essential truths of growth and memory. He felt a deep, abiding gratitude for the silence. He knew that his time as a scout was truly over. He was no longer searching for anything, he had already found it. As he drifted off to sleep, he could hear the faint, rhythmic pulse of the repair spores working on the hull, a soft, scratching sound that felt like the beginning of a new life. The Amber Wanderer was becoming part of the garden, and so was he. In the quiet hours of the next morning, Arthur observed the first tangible results of the spore slurry. The metallic sheen of the airlock's interior had softened, replaced by a subtle, pearlescent texture that felt warm to the touch. It was as if the ship were developing a skin, a biological interface that bridged the gap between human engineering and the bloom's organic logic. Encouraged, he spent the day carefully applying the mixture to the main power conduits and the life support processors. He worked slowly, enjoying the tactile nature of the task. He was no longer just maintaining a machine, he was nurturing a living entity. The ship responded with a steadier hum, the occasional rattles and groans of its aging frame silenced by the dampening effect of the new crystalline growth. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Amber Wanderer was no longer a fading relic of the outer colonies. It was being reborn in the heart of the drift. The fifth week brought a profound stillness to the sector, a period of celestial calm that the Archive of Whispers referred to as the Great Quiescence. During this time, the binary stars reached a point of perfect orbital symmetry, causing the gravitational stresses on the rings to drop to near zero. The result was an environment of absolute physical peace. The Amber Wanderer no longer groaned under the tidal forces of the nearby suns. Instead, it drifted like a seed in a still pond. Arthur woke to find that the repair spores had completed their initial work on the cockpit glass. A fine, translucent lattice now reinforced the viewing ports, acting as a secondary lens that sharpened the colors of the exterior world. The indigo of the first ring seemed deeper, and the golden light of the central sphere was now tiered into a spectrum of warm ambers and soft ochres. He spent the morning sitting in his pilot's chair, but his hands remained away from the controls. He was no longer navigating the void, he was dwelling within it. His objective for this cycle was to reach the innermost core of the structure, the central sphere itself. According to the records in the archive, the sphere was not a solid object, but a concentrated field of plasma and biological data, the literal brain of the bloom. To reach it, he would have to use the final set of light bridges, which were only accessible during the Great Quiescence. These bridges were not blue or azure like the ones in the outer rings. They were a blinding, pure white, composed of high-density photons that felt as solid as marble. Arthur packed only the essentials, a small canteen of nutrient fluid, his handwritten journal, and a single, dried leaf from the copper trees. He felt a strange necessity to bring a piece of the garden with him to the heart of the system. As he stepped out onto the first white bridge, the sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt. The bridge didn't just support his weight. It seemed to push back with a gentle, encouraging pressure, making every step feel effortless. As he moved closer to the center, the scale of the outer rings became visible in their entirety. He could see the intricate dance of the three main tiers, their rotations perfectly timed to maintain the stability of the central field. The bloom was a clock of incredible complexity, one that measured time in the growth of vines and the pulse of stars. The air here was thin but vibrated with a constant musical tone, a single, unwavering note that was the fundamental frequency of the entire structure. It was the sound of existence itself. Arthur found that he didn't need his breather here. The atmosphere was so saturated with the energy of the central sphere that his body felt sustained by the mere act of being present. His skin tingled with a pleasant warmth, and the old ache in his knees, a remnant of a crash landing on a frozen moon a decade ago, vanished completely. The entrance to the central sphere was a shimmering portal of liquid light. There was no hatch or doorway, only a thinning of the veil between the rings and the core. Arthur took a deep breath and stepped through. He expected to find a world of blinding light and heat, but instead, he found himself in a vast, cool space that looked like a starlit forest at midnight. The stars were actually clusters of data spores, millions of them floating in the air, each one containing a fragment of the bloom's collective memory. In the center of the space stood a single, massive tree made of pure, white light. Its branches reached out toward the edges of the sphere, connecting to the light bridges and, through them, to every leaf and creature in the rings. This was the source. This was the gardener. Arthur approached the tree, his boots making no sound on the floor of soft, glowing sand. He felt a presence in the room, not a ghost or a person, but a vast, ancient awareness that was currently focused entirely on him. It wasn't a hostile gaze. It was the look of a parent watching a child take its first steps. The tree's branches began to sway, and a soft, rhythmic pulsing filled the air. Arthur realized that the tree was communicating, not through words or images, but through the direct transfer of emotion. He felt the immense pride the architects had felt when the first ring stabilized. He felt the quiet satisfaction of the glass-furred creatures as they tended the moss. And then he felt a new emotion, a profound, welcoming curiosity directed at the Amber Wanderer and the man who had brought it here. The bloom was not just tolerating his presence, it was learning from him. It was absorbing the human qualities he brought, the capacity for hope, the stubborn persistence of the explorer, and the quiet appreciation of beauty. Arthur sat at the base of the light tree and opened his journal. He began to read aloud, his voice sounding steady and resonant in the vast chamber. He read his descriptions of the copper trees, the taste of the golden fruit, and the melodies of the archive. He read about his life before the drift, the lonely years in the void, and the sense of peace he had finally found. As he spoke, the data spores drifted closer, circling him in a slow, hypnotic dance. They were recording his story, adding it to the eternal record of the sanctuary. He was no longer just a guest. He was becoming a contributor to the very soul of the bloom. He stayed in the central sphere for what felt like hours, though time had little meaning in such a place. He felt a deep, physical connection to the structure, as if his own heartbeat were being synchronized with the pulse of the light tree. He realized that the transformation he had been undergoing was almost complete. He would never be able to return to the world he had left behind. The noise, the greed, and the frantic pace of human expansion would be unbearable now. He had been tuned to a higher frequency. When he finally stood up to leave, the light tree bowed its branches toward him in a silent gesture of farewell. He stepped back through the portal of liquid light, feeling a sense of clarity and purpose that was absolute. The return journey across the white bridges was a meditative experience. He watched the rings rotate below him, seeing the patterns of growth and energy distribution with a new understanding. He saw the amber wanderer perched on the edge of the first ring, and it no longer looked like a foreign object. The crystalline lattice had now covered nearly a third of the hull, turning the orange ship into a shimmering, iridescent part of the landscape. The ship was no longer a tool for travel. It was a permanent dwelling, a part of the garden. He realized that he would never need to fire the engines again. The bloom would provide everything he needed, and in return, he would provide the one thing the system lacked: a new perspective, a fresh voice to add to the archive of whispers. When he reached the ship, he didn't go inside immediately. He stood on the crystalline surface of the ring and looked out at the binary stars. They were beginning to move out of their perfect symmetry, signaling the end of the great quiescence. The ambient hum was returning to its normal, complex harmony. Arthur felt a deep, abiding joy. He was a man who had reached the end of his journey and found that it was actually a beginning. He entered the Amber Wanderer and headed to the galley. He made a fresh pot of chamomile tea, the steam rising in the soft, amber light of the cabin. He looked at the small fern in its pot on the desk. It had grown significantly in the last few weeks, its leaves a vibrant, healthy green. It, too, was thriving in the light of the drift. That evening, Arthur sat at his desk and began to write the final entry in his journal. He didn't write about coordinates or resources. He wrote about the feeling of the light tree and the silence of the core. He wrote about the responsibility of being a witness to such beauty. He knew that one day, perhaps hundreds of years from now, another traveler might find their way to the verdant drift. They would find the archive of whispers, and they would find his voice there, telling them that the universe was not a place to be conquered, but a garden to be tended. He felt a profound sense of completion. He closed the journal and placed it on the shelf, next to the maps of stars he would never visit again. As he lay down in his bunk, he could feel the ship breathing with him. The life support systems were now fully integrated with the ring's nutrient cycle, and the air in the cabin was as fresh as the air in the emerald woods. He closed his eyes and listened to the rhythmic pulse of the bloom, a sound that was now as familiar to him as his own breath. He was home, he was safe, and he was part of something that would last forever. Outside, the spores continued their dance, and the dark leaves of the solar ring continued to drink in the light, ensuring that the sanctuary would remain a beacon of peace in the vast, silent void. The 6th week marked the completion of the transformation, a period Arthur began to think of as the final grafting. The Amber Wanderer was no longer a vessel of metal and wires. The crystalline lattice had woven itself entirely through the hull, merging with the primary systems until the ship resembled a great, amber-colored seed pod anchored to the ring. Inside, the walls pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent glow, and the air scrubbers had been replaced by a climbing vine that filtered the atmosphere with a sweet, floral efficiency. Arthur sat in what had once been the pilot's seat, but the controls were now covered in a layer of soft, silver moss. He felt no urge to clear it away. The sensors were silent because he no longer needed them to tell him what was happening outside. He could feel the rotation of the rings in his very bones, a gentle, rhythmic swaying that felt as natural as a heartbeat. He had become a sensory extension of the bloom, a living nerve ending in a galactic garden. He spent his final day of active exploration returning to the first ring's edge, where he had first stepped out onto the crystalline surface. The view was unchanged, yet his perception of it had deepened. He could see the intricate web of energy flowing from the solar collector through the primary veins and into the roots of the indigo vines. He saw the glass-furred creatures not as alien animals, but as fellow laborers in an endless project of care. He realized that his presence here had altered the bloom in a small but significant way. The archive of whispers was already echoing with his observations, and the central light tree had adjusted its frequency to accommodate the unique resonance of a human mind. He was the first of his kind to stay, to listen, and to truly belong. As the binary suns began their slow descent toward the horizon of the structure, Arthur made one last trip to the quiet room with the console of sand. He stood before the glowing grains, and this time he did not wait for them to mirror his thoughts. He reached out and placed both hands into the cool, luminous dust. He poured his final intentions into the sand, a wish for the continued safety of the sanctuary, a hope for the eventual wisdom of his species, and a promise to remain the faithful guardian of the drift. The sand responded by swirling into a complex, three-dimensional representation of the amber wanderer, which then dissolved into a pattern of interlocking rings. It was a sign of acceptance, a confirmation that his journey had reached its destined conclusion. He felt a wave of profound peace wash over him, a warmth that started in his chest and radiated outward until he felt he might simply dissolve into the light. He returned to his ship as the night spores began to rise, their glow more vibrant than ever. The interior of the Amber Wanderer was warm and inviting, smelling of chamomile and the rich, damp earth of the second ring. He prepared a final cup of tea, using water drawn from the nutrient pools, and sat at his small desk. His journal was full, every page covered in sketches and reflections. He laid the book in a small alcove he had carved into the crystalline wall, where the repair spores would eventually seal it behind a protective, transparent layer. It would be his legacy, a physical record to accompany the digital whispers he had left in the archive. He felt a sense of immense lightness, as if the weight of his previous life, the regrets, the ambitions, and the loneliness had finally been stripped away by the constant, gentle pressure of the light. In the final hours of the cycle, Arthur moved to the cockpit and looked out through the reinforced glass. The central sphere was pulsing with a soft, silver light, casting long shadows across the emerald woods and the indigo plains. He could see the light bridges shimmering like ribbons of silk in the darkness. He knew that the bloom would continue its work long after he was gone, and that his energy would eventually be recycled into the very vines and trees he had grown to love. He was not afraid of this transition. He welcomed it. He was a part of the harmony now, a single note in a song that had no end. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the ship's biological interface gently connecting with his own nervous system, a soft, tingling sensation that felt like a warm embrace. The last thing Arthur did before settling into his final rest was to disable the ship's external distress beacon, the very last piece of active human technology on board. The silence that followed was absolute and beautiful. He watched the stars through the viewing port, seeing them not as distant, cold points of light, but as the neighbors of the garden. He felt a deep connection to every sun and every planet in the void, a realization that the universe was not a vast, empty space, but a crowded, living entity that was always growing. He closed his eyes, his breath slowing to match the rhythmic pulse of the rings. He was no longer Arthur the Scout, nor Arthur the Exile. He was the gardener of the verdant drift, and the garden was in full bloom. Outside, the Amber Wanderer shimmered in the starlight, its orange hull now barely visible beneath a layer of crystalline growth and silver moss. A group of glass-furred creatures gathered near the airlock, their trilling voices joining the harmonic chord of the rings. The central light tree flared once, a bright white signal of welcome that echoed through every tier of the structure. The great respiration began again, a synchronized expansion of life that moved through the indigo vines and the dark leaves of the solar ring. The sanctuary was at peace, its new inhabitant finally at home. The bloom continued its slow, graceful rotation through the void, a hidden jewel of light and memory, waiting for the next age to begin. The binary suns rose once more, casting a golden glow across the tapestry of the rings. The light bridges remained firm, the nutrient pools remained full, and the archive of whispers grew a little richer with the addition of a new, steady heartbeat. The verdant drift remained silent to the rest of the galaxy, a secret kept by the stars and the man who had chosen to stay. In the heart of the void, where the silence was usually cold and empty, there was now a warmth that would never fade. The garden was tended, the record was complete, and the light was eternal. Arthur drifted into the deep, resonant sleep of the rings, his mind a tapestry of indigo and gold, forever a part of the silent architecture of belonging.